Here's my game of the day from the chess.com Isle of Man International, and we're up to round 8, the penultimate round, getting close to the finishing line. And I've picked the board 1 encounter between Arkady Naiditsch and Hikaru Nakamura. This was incredibly tense, as you can see from the photo. The game reached an extraordinary climax around about the time control. Incredible interest in this game, of course. So the players, Arkady Naiditsch, rated 27-21, very optimistic player, capable of beating anyone in the world. He has incredible confidence. He beat Carlsen a couple of years ago in the Grenka tournament. He started out life in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Republic of Latvia. Latvia gained its independence, so that's already two countries he's lived under. And then he emigrated to Germany, played for the German national team for several years, but now he lives in Baku in Azerbaijan and represents Azerbaijan. So he's had an extraordinary career already. Playing Hikaru Nakamura, well, we know Hikaru very well. Such an interesting player. Also, of course, incredibly ambitious and always prepared to gamble. But he's been going through a pretty rough patch of form recently, and indeed started quite shakily in this tournament. So, very keen to do well in this game. So, without further ado, let's see what happened. It was a Spanish. And Hikaru played a line which is currently quite popular with some players, for example, Mamedyarov, with Anand. It's G6 line of the Spanish. Excuse me. Good morning. Where obviously black is reasonably solid, playing black side of a Spanish, but G6 just sort of gives the game a little bit more imbalance, a little bit more interest than the main lines. And Naiditsch plays with D4. Now this very interesting continuation, and he plays this gambit line with C3. If black takes, then white simply has a lead in development, and well, in practice it's done pretty well, but very quickly Hikaru declined to take and simply played knight e7, and this is actually very well known. And here you can play e5, but Naiditsch played the sort of theoretical continuation, which is, well, the approved way of playing this with white. The idea is you damage these pawns, and because white has also a slight space advantage with this pawn on d4, then it's possible to actually attack those pawns, or at least the pawn on c6. But in compensation, you can see that black has 2 bishops and a beautiful knight on d5. So there's a kind of dynamic balance here, although theoretically speaking, white is supposed to have some advantage. So this queen had to hop out. It couldn't really live, let's say, on d7, because it would always be hit, and there's, by knights on e5 and c5. But it does find a home on the queen side. Queen c1, now the idea of that at some moment is to exchange these bishops. Exchanging those bishops would be highly desirable for white, because then just sort of makes it easier to hop in on the dark squares and takes pressure away from the pawn on d4, as well as weakening black's king. Therefore rook e8, so that means that if bishop h6, then the bishop can simply withdraw to h8. And this position has been seen before. I mean, I seem to recall actually playing this with white myself years and years ago. Here we've got h3, bishop h6 has been played before, bishop d2 selected by Naiditsch, pushing the queen away. And now the knights land on these beautiful outposts on c5 and e5, really active. Rook d8 from Hikaru. This position has actually been reached before game of the Dutch Grandmaster Naiditsch, who played b3 in this position, and that's a very decent move, just taking some pressure off the b file and allowing the queen to move as well. But Naiditsch played h3 after almost a quarter of an hour's thought, and h3 of course a very, very useful move, just ruling out any back rank issues, potentially giving the king a square on h2, and even g4 comes into consideration at some moment. And now Hikaru had his first big think of the game. He'd really played his opening moves extremely quickly, so he had about a half an hour time advantage on Naiditsch, who'd spent much more time on these moves. That seems to be often the way with Hikaru. He bashes out his moves, but then it gets to a certain point, sort of around about the end of his preparation, and he sort of goes into the tank a bit. So knight f6, well, this is a decent move. The rook looking at the pawn on d4. So the knight withdrew to b3, protecting the pawn on d4. And of course there's a threat to take on c6. And it's very difficult to defend that, because if rook d6, then of course the knight just leaps back to c4 with a fork. So Hikaru, well, he had another big think around here, another 20-minute think, and played rook d5, and I suspect that he'd seen the game continuation to this point, and well, we're going to see the point of playing rook d5 in a second. So Naiditsch naturally took the pawn on c6. Nakamura exchanged and played bishop f8, preventing knight e7 check. So it's a clear extra pawn for white. The knight hopped back to e5. Bishop e6 from Hikaru. I mean, here it's not easy to control this position. There's no doubt that black has compensation because of the two bishops, particularly this light squared bishop, which doesn't have an opponent, and control over d5. And white still has to bring the queen's rook into play. If we could sort of magically play queen c2 and rook c1, then, well, white, I think, would have pretty good control, but take some time. Bishop c3 is a decent move here, just to sort of lock everything down. Naiditsch played knight c4 instead. It was also not bad. And then knight e3 to attack the rook. Now, if the if the rook withdraws to a normal square, let's say rook d8, then knight c5. And if this is taken, well, this is what white wants, because there are dark square weaknesses around the king. Sorry, let me highlight those correctly. And the bishop can come into c3 to look at those dark squares, and that is very dangerous for black. So at this moment, well, Hikaru had planned this. He switched the rook over to h5, so there is no doubting his intent in this position. By hook or by crook, he's going to attack on the king's side. He has to. He understands very well, if he falls back passively, then he has zero winning chances, and it just makes life easy for the opponent. He's an experienced guy, very practical guy. Knight c5 from Naiditsch, so he's desperate to grab one of those bishops. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes. So again, we've got to that situation where this bishop just needs to emerge onto the dark squares, and this will be very unpleasant for black. Once the queen and the rook come into play, the black king will suffer. But Hikaru spent precisely 6 seconds here countering those ideas. He played bishop takes pawn, and by this stage Naiditsch was running short of time, and yeah, we're reaching the real climax of the game. So Hikaru, I think he probably had, from memory, maybe at least a 10-minute time advantage, maybe even more. And Naiditsch was already running pretty close. So what happens if this is taken? Well, first of all, Queen f3, so preventing white blocking with c6. And actually, white can hold a draw here by playing like this. But I think by this stage, that would kind of be a defeat for Naiditsch. You know, he realizes that he's got the upper hand here. He certainly doesn't want to give Nakamura a sniff of anything around the king. So he plays c6. And the queen goes back to c8. And once again, well, taking that bishop would be disastrous, actually. But here, Naiditsch, well, he was short of time already. He played pawn to f3, which gives the king a little escape square. In fact, queen c3 is a better move. Obviously, if the knight falls back, then that's a considerable gain compared to the game. And if bishop takes, then the queen can actually defend along the third rank. So this is actually the best continuation. But f3 kind of feels normal as well, to cover the e4 square, the g4 square, and as I said, to give the king a little escape square as well. And again, Hikaru did not back down. He understands how to create practical difficulties for his opponent, particularly when they're running short of time. So here, for example, if he drops back with the bishop, now material is actually even, but you can see the initiative would change hands. Suddenly black would have to worry about all those dark squares around the king. So no, he doesn't want to end up in some slightly worse position where he's got to defend. He continued. Bishop takes pawn. So he's now a piece down, but at least he's got a chance to attack his opponent's king. And this is extremely difficult for white to defend, particularly when you have so little time on the clock. Running this over with a computer, it comes up with some extraordinary variations. For example, I just want to show you this because this is so ridiculous and so unlike anything that a human would ever play. But my computer suggests queen f4. Well, fair enough, it stops queen h2, but allows this. So obviously an attack here. And then it recommends queen takes knight. And it says in this position that white is actually winning. Well, my goodness. I can imagine Naiditsch looking at that with, you know, a minute on the clock and just thinking, no way do I want my king staggering around the middle of the board. Well, you can have fun analysing that if you want to, but it looks utterly ridiculous. Bishop c3, a far more natural move, bringing the bishop into the game, attacking the knight, and preparing perhaps to switch the queen and the rook to the king's side. So knight d5 played. Bishop d4, fine, covers some squares. And there is actually no obvious continuation for black here. And there is obviously potential for white to go on the counter-attack with, well, if a queen or a rook land there, then it's obviously mate. So Hikaru played f6. And in fact, it's the kind of move which is very unpleasant to meet when you're in time pressure. Because it's putting the onus on you. And in fact, there is a point to this. There is a kind of threat. It introduces the possibility of rook g5, which is certainly not a winning move, but because the knight can be defended, but nevertheless it's an extra attacking possibility. So for example, if queen f1 here, then check here and rook g5, and black has definite compensation in that position. That is certainly not easy to defend. You've got to remember this knight could come flying into f4 at some moment as well. So coming back here, Naiditsch played queen e1. So introducing some counter-attacking possibilities up here, followed by a check on d7, exchanging queens. So therefore king f7. Yeah, I mean, if queen takes pawn, let's just see how this might finish. And now rook f1, and well, things are going in white's favour. And here, actually, not very often knights are terribly placed, but actually on g2. But here it covers so many important squares around the king, and there's queen d7, bishop takes pawn. White should be winning that position. So coming back here, queen e1 just played. King f7 looks pretty normal, and now rook d1. So the queen's rook finally entering the game. And here, well, it's interesting that Hikaru thought for 10 minutes here, trying to get it right, and Naiditsch was almost playing on the increments. He was down to kind of 1 or 2 minutes. They do get 30 seconds added each time they make a move, but still, in this kind of situation, really difficult when there's so much calculation. Hikaru could have taken this pawn, and that, I think, I mean, I wouldn't like to guess the outcome of the game after that move, because the queen can switch back to the h-file, and after a check on one of these two squares, then the f-file is open and the rook can check. So I think all bets would be off after that. But instead Hikaru played rook g5, threatening mate. And after queen e2, well, he just played king g7. Now maybe he'd overlooked something around here, I don't know. If knight f4, that's the move we'd like to play, then queen c4 check. And if king g7, then bishop takes f6, and queen takes f4 is obviously fine for white. So I don't know whether he intended that, or, well, I don't think so. No, he certainly didn't, because he played king g7 almost immediately. That's clever tactics when your opponent's in time pressure, to plan a little sequence of moves. So now knight f4 is a threat. And actually Naiditsch got it wrong. He should have played queen f2 here, and the game would probably end in a draw after this. So threatening mate on h1. And the position, well, a plausible continuation would actually be to repeat moves with a draw. But instead, Naiditsch played bishop c5. And this is a mistake, because here Nakamura can play knight f4. Now, both players had calculated this variation. Rook d7 check. Now, the king cannot come up the board. If king h6, then there's a check on f8, followed by rook h7. So queen takes rook. This is a mad variation. Pawn takes queen. Knight check. This is all false so far. Now, black has to stop that pawn. Rook takes. King takes. Now, we were looking at this in the live commentary, and I thought, oh well, rook takes pawn, and bishop takes. Well, white might be slightly better there with this a pawn, although black has counterplay. But of course, we forgot that before taking on d7, black can simply play a6 and then rook d7, and that is what Hikaru forgot about. So he rejected knight f4 incredibly. Remember, he was the one who had more time than Naiditsch, and instead he played rook e5. But that takes the pressure off white. He returned with the rook, and now rook d4 starts to defend along the fourth rank. Obviously rules out knight f4. The The queen dropped back, and now you can see that, well, the attack is almost over. Naiditsch was finding his feet. He was basically playing on the increment here, playing, you know, just over 30 seconds per move. But you can see he's centralized his pieces. This queen has moved away from the king side. And here Hikaru played a5, well, an admission that his attack has gone. If he'd played knight f4, now the idea was, if that's taken, then rook takes. But actually, then there's this nice sequence. This move, bishop f8, crops up in these positions now and again. And again, there's mate on the h file. I mean, it's fantastically complicated, having to, very difficult, playing these moves in time pressure. But a5, yeah, an admission that basically his attack has gone nowhere. And so Naiditsch had just over 30 seconds to play this final move of the time control, and he simply played a3 because there was obviously no threat. And this was Hikaru's last move, and he had maybe 2 minutes to play his final move. But I think here, well, he still has 2 pawns for the bishop and can still make life a little bit difficult. But his last move was not good. I think rook f5, rook h5 are possible, you know, maybe give more chances. But he played h5. You know, he's obviously concerned about his king, but it's a mistake. Naiditsch had time to think after the time control and played king h2, an excellent move, because suddenly with the pawn sitting on h5, then there's no possibility that black can switch to an attack on the h file, and the king actually finds security on h2, on the h file. And Naiditsch's technique was excellent. Queen f4 is a really good move that introduces the possibility of rook e7, where we'll see how in a second. Queen b7 from Nakamura, rook e7 check, excellent move. So if knight takes, then the queen comes in, and, well, basically the queen just picks up everything here. I can keep going for a little bit. Now if king up, then bishop mate, and then, well, you can see that's completely over. So coming back here, rook e7 check, king h8, bishop comes back to d4. So now it's absolutely clear that white is utterly winning this position. His king is completely safe, and now black's king is the one under fire. If knight takes rook, then bishop f6 wins, queen f7 following. So bishop rook f5 protects f6, rook d7, that makes way potentially for the queen to come into the game here. Queen b8 by Hikaru Nakamura, and, well, you can see from the photo the players there. Hikaru not looking terribly happy, and after this move Naiditsch moved in with the queen to c6, and that was the final move of the game. Well, black is completely lost here, of course. Sorry, there was just one final trick here, actually. Of course, Hikaru is setting up some kind of discovered attack here with a c6 check. But yes, queen c6 just shuts down that possibility completely, and black has gone here. Well, great disappointment for Hikaru Nakamura. You can see that this photo was taken just after he resigned. Yeah, they had a quick chat after the game. A wonderful performance, I think, from Arkady Naiditsch. An incredibly difficult position to handle, particularly when you're short of time. But there were a couple of moments where he made mistakes, but overall I think he handled the position extremely well. You can see a photo of him being interviewed after the game, and, well, his mood was kind of relief and happiness all mixed in one. He said he was too tired to feel nervous, actually. Great stuff. So that means that going into the final round, Arkady Naiditsch shares the lead with Radoslav Wojtaszek, who defeated Michael Adams. So those two will play in the final round. They have 6.5. And there are 4 players on 6 points. We have Jeffrey Xiong, who plays Garwin Jones. He defeated Aronian. And we have Maxime Vacher-Lagrave and Wang Hao also on 6. So I'm predicting a solid game at the top, probably a draw between Naiditsch and Wojtaszek. So maybe one of those 4 has a chance to catch them. We'll find out tomorrow. Do check out the playlist if you want to see other games from this tournament, and also the playlists of, well, all these players actually. You'll find them up there if you want to click on that. And if you're not a subscriber, then click down there. You'll find the button. And if you want to support the channel, then remember you can make a one-off donation on PayPal. You'll find the button up there, or consider joining us on patreon.com and check out all the rewards, the extra videos, newsletters, and all kinds of stuff. Thanks for watching.